They say family is where the storm stops. But for me, the deadliest hurricane was nurtured right at our dining table. When money blinds reason, those sharing your blood will push you into the abyss without a second thought. But they forgot one crucial thing. Not everyone thrown overboard drowns. Some learn to become predators. Hold your breath and listen to how my grandfather and I buried their greed at the bottom of the sea. Hello, dear listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for always being here with us. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with zero operating budget, which means we will not be uploading new videos here for the foreseeable future, and will be moving our operations entirely to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please support us by joining our Patreon's channel to hear even more exclusive, real stories that are far better, much longer, and contain detailed situations we cannot publicize on YouTube, featuring multiple emotional voices in a single tale. You can easily join by scanning the Patreon QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link down in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story as I, Rowan Chapman, recount exactly how the storm finally broke. The heavy rain was slamming against the tall windows of my downtown Seattle apartment, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown violently against the glass. It was a massive squall, the kind of weather system that churns the Pacific Ocean into a violent, black washing machine. At 28 years old, my life as a data analyst at Aegis Nexus Solutions was entirely built on predicting anomalies and finding the quiet logic hidden inside chaotic systems. I was eating a late dinner, going over a complex dataset on my monitor, when the harsh vibration of a video call shattered the quiet safety of my living room. The caller ID flashed with a name I rarely wanted to see: Declan. My older brother was a severe gambling addict who usually only called when he needed a quick loan to cover his endless debts. He was a man consumed by his own envy, carrying a toxic, lifelong jealousy toward me because I chose to build a career instead of relying on the family wealth. I swiped the screen to answer, fully bracing myself for another pathetic, shouting demand for cash, instead of the desperate, sweating face of a man dodging loan sharks. Declan stared back at me with a sickening, victorious smirk. His eyes were wide with a manic, cold energy that immediately put me on high alert. "High is gone, Rowan," Declan declared, his voice dripping with dark triumph. "Grandpa Arthur's sailboat lost signal right in the middle of the storm 3 days ago. The Coast Guard called off the search this afternoon. He is officially presumed dead." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Declan did not even try to fake a single tear for the man who raised us. Instead, he leaned closer to his camera, his smile widening into a predatory grin. "I already have my lawyer looking at the will," he continued, his tone turning sharp and openly arrogant. "As the eldest male, I am taking full control of Deep Current Salvage. The entire marine salvage company belongs to me now. You can pack up any delusions you had about getting a single share." Before I could even process the absolute cruelty of his delivery, a sharp, clinking sound echoed through his end of the line. I recognized the opulent background behind him immediately. He was sitting in Aunt Beatrice's house. Beatrice had spent her entire life enabling Declan's absolute worst habits, constantly covering his tracks and feeding his unchecked entitlement. "Cheers to that, darling!" Beatrice's shrill voice rang out clearly from just off camera. Thank God the little brat Rowan is finally crossed out of the picture for good. They were actually celebrating, while the Coast Guard was supposedly pulling back their rescue boats from a raging ocean. My own flesh and blood were clinking glasses over my grandfather's watery grave. Any normal person would have screamed at the screen. They would have hurled vicious insults, collapsed into a fit of hysterical sobbing, or furiously demanded answers. I did absolutely none of those things. The raging storm outside my window felt completely disconnected from the sudden, absolute zero temperature freezing in my veins. My breathing slowed to a perfectly rhythmic pace. The chaotic noise of their celebration became nothing more than a dull hum in my ears. I held the phone perfectly still for a long moment, letting Declan soak in what he falsely believed was my defeated, helpless shock. Then, without uttering a single syllable, I reached out and slowly rotated my phone away from my face. I panned the camera past my dining table, past the kitchen counter, and aimed the lens directly at the worn, vintage leather armchair sitting in the corner of my living room. Sitting right there, completely illuminated by the warm glow of a reading lamp, was a man who was supposed to be resting at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, Grandpa Arthur. I was not a ghost, nor was he drowning. He was comfortably seated inside my apartment, wearing his thick fisherman's sweater, calmly blowing on a steaming spoonful of New England clam chowder. Hearing the sudden, dead silence echoing from the phone speaker, Arthur paused his meal. He slowly raised his head, locking his razor-sharp, steel-gray eyes directly onto the camera lens. The look on his weathered face was intense enough to freeze hell itself. Through the phone, I heard a sharp gasp that sounded like all the oxygen had been forcefully vacuumed out of Beatrice's dining room. The immediate sound of a crystal glass slipping from her fingers and shattering violently against the hardwood floor echoed loudly through the speaker. Declan's victorious smirk vanished in a millisecond, his face drained of every single drop of blood, leaving him looking like a freshly embalmed corpse. His jaw unhinged, opening and closing helplessly as his brain misfired. Completely unable to process the impossible reality staring right back at him, before my brother could even manage to stammer out a single pathetic word, Grandpa Arthur slowly wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He leaned forward, looking straight at the terrified face of his grandson on the small screen, and spoke with the casual, terrifying calm of a man who owned the sea. "What a coincidence," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "My doctor just told me I could live to be 100 years old." Grandpa Arthur reached forward with a calloused finger and firmly tapped the screen, terminating the call and plunging Declan back into the dark. 3 days prior to that video call, my phone had rung at 2 o'clock in the morning. The caller ID showed an unknown satellite number. When I answered, a gruff, exhausted voice instructed me to drive down to a secluded, unregulated pier 40 miles south of the city. A small, independent commercial fishing trawler had practically bumped into a dark, drifting sailboat pitching violently in the growing swells. Aboard that dead vessel was Arthur. His navigation screens were black. His VHF radio was completely silent. Instead of radioing the Coast Guard and triggering a massive public rescue operation, my grandfather had handed the fishing captain $500 in soaking wet cash to keep his mouth shut and let him borrow a phone. Even out there, battered by freezing winds and towering waves, his survival instincts had screamed at him that this was no mechanical failure. He knew he had been targeted. The moment I brought him back to my apartment, I logged into the Aegis Nexus Solutions employee portal and submitted a request for an indefinite, unpaid emergency leave of absence. I shut my laptop and immediately made a secure call to a man named Silas. Silas was an independent private investigator and a former Navy intelligence officer who operated out of a heavily fortified, unmarked warehouse near the industrial docks. He was a man who traded in secrets and preferred shadows over the spotlight. If there was foul play involved, Silas would find the thread and pull it until the entire sweater unraveled. Under the cover of darkness, utilizing a discreet private towing service Silas trusted, we managed to drag Arthur's battered sailboat into the investigator's dry dock for a forensic teardown. The massive warehouse smelled of engine oil, rust, and old sea salt. Harsh, cold halogen work, lights illuminated the fiberglass hull of the vessel. Arthur and I stood in total silence as Silas climbed down into the cramped electrical bay beneath the helm. For nearly 2 hours, the only sounds were the clinking of metal tools and Silas's heavy breathing as he traced every single wire and circuit board. When he finally emerged from the hatch, his face was carved into a grim, unreadable mask. He held up a thick cluster of heavy-duty wires, their protective rubber casings stripped back. "The storm did not kill your electronics," Silas stated, his voice a low, echoing rumble in the cavernous room. "I checked the primary breaker, the backup battery arrays, and the localized fuses. They are completely intact. but your communication module and your global positioning systems were physically disconnected from the power source. Silas walked over to the metal workbench, throwing the wires down under a magnifying glass. He motioned for us to step closer. "Look at the copper threading," he instructed, shining a high-powered penlight directly onto the exposed metal. If a violent wave or structural damage had caused a catastrophic failure, these wires would be frayed, violently ripped, or burnt out from a power surge. Instead, the cuts are perfectly flush, a clean, angled slice. Someone used professional-grade, heavy-duty wire snips to blind and deafen this boat. They did not just want you lost, Arthur. They wanted you completely erased off the map. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the three of us. The implications were monstrous. The ocean is an unforgiving executioner, and whoever sabotaged the boat had weaponized the Pacific itself. But Silas was not finished. A man who cuts wires in the dark inevitably leaves a footprint. Silas walked over to his massive bank of computer monitors. Earlier that morning, he had covertly bypassed the cybersecurity firewalls of the city's Port Authority, downloading gigabytes of raw security camera footage from the marina where Arthur docked his boat. "I scrubbed through the tape from the night before you set sail," Silas explained, rapidly typing commands into his keyboard to bring up a grainy, black-and-white video file. "Your slip is located in a blind spot for the main gate cameras, but there is an old, rusted pan and tilt camera mounted on the fuel dock. It catches the edge of your walkway." Silas. Hit the play button. The timestamp on the screen read 11:45 at night. Through the heavy static interference of the cheap camera, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette emerged from the shadows. The figure was dressed entirely in black, wearing a heavy hooded sweatshirt pulled down low to obscure his face. We watched the screen as the dark shape slipped silently onto the deck of the sailboat, disappearing down into the main cabin. "Watch what happens when he climbs back out 20 minutes later," Silas murmured, slowing the playback speed down to a frame-by-frame crawl. On the monitor, the figure reemerged from the hatch, as he reached out to grab the stainless steel railing and swing himself back onto the wooden dock. His foot slipped on the damp fiberglass. To catch his balance, he jerked his arm outward. The violent motion caused the heavy fabric of his sleeve to ride up sharply, exposing his bare right wrist to the harsh glare of a nearby security lamp. Silas paused the video and zoomed in, running the heavily pixelated image through an enhancement software. The blurry pixels smoothed out, revealing a distinct, undeniable shape inked directly into the skin. It was a thick, nautical anchor tattoo, wrapped in a jagged chain. The air in the room instantly turned to solid ice. I felt a wave of nausea crash violently into my stomach. I knew that tattoo. I had stared at it thousands of times across family dinner tables. It was the same tattoo my brother had drunkenly forced a cheap parlor artist to ink onto his right wrist when he turned 21 years old. I looked over at my grandfather. Arthur stood completely paralyzed. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. His knuckles were bone white as he gripped the edge of the metal table. This was not a tragic accident. This was not a crime of opportunity born from a sudden flash of greed. This was calculated, cold-blooded, premeditated murder. The man sharing our blood had meticulously planned to send his own grandfather into a watery grave, all to steal an empire he was too lazy to build himself. "It is Declan," I whispered, the reality tasting like poison on my tongue. "He tried to kill you." The revelation in the warehouse should have been the end of it. A normal person, caught dead to rights in a failed assassination attempt, would have fled the state or begged for mercy. But I had severely underestimated the sheer, boundless audacity of my family. Once the shock of that video call wore off, my brother and our aunt did not show a single ounce of remorse. Instead, they immediately pivoted, launching a masterclass in psychological manipulation. In less than 2 days, the Seattle waterfront was inundated with a malicious, highly coordinated smear campaign. My sibling and aunt played the roles of distraught, deeply concerned family members. They spread a completely false story to every port authority, longshoreman, and competing recovery business in town. Their version of events insisted that the tempest had shattered my grandfather's sanity. They alleged the terrifying maritime experience had caused profound psychological trauma and extreme delusional instability, even more damaging. They depicted me as a scheming, avaricious grifter. The gossip suggested that I had deeply manipulated a vulnerable elder, isolating him within my residence to unfairly pressure him into handing over the business assets. The sheer shamelessness of their lie was suffocating. They were weaponizing his survival against us. The climax of this disgusting theatrical performance arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. A heavy, aggressive pounding rattled my apartment door. When I looked through the peephole, my blood boiled. Declan stood in the hallway, looking perfectly groomed and dripping with fake concern. Beside him stood a man in an ill-fitting gray suit, holding a leather briefcase, acting as his legal counsel. Flanking them were two massive, broad-shouldered men wearing blue medical scrubs, looking less like healthcare professionals and more like nightclub bouncers. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the security chain firmly engaged. Declan immediately shoved a thick stack of papers into the opening. "Open the door," my brother demanded, his voice projecting loudly enough for the neighbors to hear his fake distress. "We have a court order for an emergency psychiatric evaluation. You cannot keep him locked up in there. He needs medical help, and I am stepping in as his medical proxy." The lawyer in the cheap suit leaned forward, tapping the document. "This is an active mandate signed by a superior court judge, obtained via emergency ex parte hearing. If you interfere with this psychiatric hold, we will have you arrested for elder abuse and unlawful detainment." I stared at the papers. They had genuinely managed to push through a temporary injunction based entirely on their fabricated testimony. They intended to drag my grandfather out of my home in a straitjacket, lock him in a psychiatric ward, and legally declare him incompetent. It was a dirty, underhanded legal maneuver designed to completely neutralize him. I was about to slam the door in their faces when a heavy, calloused hand gently rested on my shoulder. "Let them in," Arthur commanded quietly. I slid the chain off and stepped back. Declan marched into the living room, puffing his chest out, trailed by his fake doctor thugs. They were ready for a screaming match. They were ready for an old man to yell, curse, and act exactly like the deranged, paranoid lunatic they claimed him to be, which would only prove their case. Arthur gave them absolutely nothing. He did not yell. He did not defend himself. Instead, my grandfather walked over to the heavy canvas duffel bag he had brought from the boat. Without breaking eye contact with Declan, he reached inside and pulled out a massive, heavy-gauge pump-action shotgun, the exact kind Alaskan fishermen carry to defend against charging grizzly bears. The two men in medical scrubs instantly froze, the color draining out of their faces. The lawyer took a panicked step backward, bumping into a bookshelf. Arthur calmly sat down in his leather armchair. He rested the heavy steel barrel across his knees. He reached onto the side table, picked up a small bottle of gun oil and a clean rag, and methodically began to polish the wooden stock. He had not loaded a single shell into the chamber, but they did not know that. The metallic, rhythmic clicking sound of the pump action sliding back and forth echoed like a death knell in the silent apartment. He did not aim the weapon. He did not make a single verbal threat. He just sat there, projecting an aura of pure, unadulterated violence. The psychological dominance was absolute. He was letting them know that this was not a courtroom. This was his territory. "You have precisely 10 seconds to get out of my home before I decide I feel threatened by home invaders," Arthur stated, his voice a flat, emotionless rasp. Declan swallowed hard, his arrogant facade completely shattering. The two hired thugs did not wait for a second warning. They turned and sprinted out the door, abandoning their paycheck. The fake lawyer squeaked out an unintelligible apology and scrambled after them. Declan glared at me with pure venom before finally backing out into the hallway and fleeing the building. We had won the battle, but as I sat down at my computer to review the fallout, I realized they were winning the war. The temporary injunction Declan had filed was not just a medical proxy. Attached to the psychiatric hold was an emergency asset freeze. Deep Current Salvage was completely paralyzed. The corporate bank accounts were locked. The payroll was suspended. The massive salvage vessels sitting in the harbor were legally grounded. I pulled up the corporate inventory manifests and cross-referenced them with the court filings. That was when the true, terrifying scope of his plans snapped into focus. Declan did not want to run a marine salvage empire. He despised hard work. He had zero interest in managing crews or navigating union contracts. I stared at the screen, my eyes locking onto a specific company asset located in a secondary warehouse near the industrial district. The facility housed the company's most advanced, cutting-edge inventory. It was packed with remotely operated underwater vehicles, pressurized deep-sea diving suits, and highly specialized sonar mapping equipment. The total liquid value was easily worth over $2 million, according to the fine print of the emergency injunction, as acting proxy. Declan had the authority to liquidate non-essential assets, to cover the supposedly astronomical costs of Arthur's impending medical care and company debt. He only needed absolute control for 7 days. 7 days to quietly sell off a fortune in high-tech equipment to the highest bidder, pocket the cash, and leave the company an empty, hollowed-out shell. Howe was not trying to take over the family business. He was preparing to completely gut it. To understand the true nature of a predator, you have to look at what they are hunting. I knew my brother was lazy and chronically entitled, but the sheer velocity of his actions made absolutely zero logical sense. To forcibly liquidate over $2 million worth of highly specialized, cutting-edge marine equipment in a mere 7 days meant he was going to sell it for pennies on the dollar. In the corporate world, you only burn down your own assets that quickly. If you are desperately starved for immediate, untraceable liquidity, I needed to see his private ledger. I reached out to Silas again, giving him the green light to take the gloves off and dig into the deepest, darkest corners of my brother's digital footprint. What Silas uncovered and sent to my encrypted email. Less than 24 hours later was not a bad business strategy. It was a terrifying financial autopsy. My brother had not merely maxed out his credit cards or taken a bad loan from a shady bank. He had stepped completely outside the boundaries of the legal financial system. For the past 6 months, he had been making frequent, unrecorded trips down to Portland. Through his degenerate gambling connections, he had gained entry into a highly illegal underground casino operated by a notoriously ruthless organized crime syndicate. They were a violent faction that preyed on arrogant, wealthy fools who thought they were smarter than the house. Declan, possessing all the arrogance in the world and none of the actual cash, had opened a massive line of shadow credit with them at a staggering 30% weekly interest rate. He sat at their high-stakes tables, drinking complimentary champagne, and proceeded to lose absolutely everything. The spreadsheets Silas forwarded to me were chilling in their clinical precision. The bottom line of the hidden ledger glowed like a radioactive warning sign. Declan owed the syndicate exactly $3 million. This was not a debt you could negotiate with a polite phone call or a structured repayment plan. Silas had managed to intercept a terrifying, voice-altered audio message left on a burner phone registered in my brother's name. A calm, dead-eyed voice informed Declan that if the $3 million was not delivered in unmarked, non-sequential bills by the end of the current month, they would strip the flesh from his bones and leave him in a rusted dumpster by the freight yards. The deadline was exactly 9 days away. Suddenly, the entire puzzle violently snapped together. The midnight sabotage at the marina, the heavy wire snips slicing through the communication cables, sending a frail old man blindly into a raging Pacific storm. None of it was born from a simple desire to become a chief executive officer. It was the frantic, animalistic flailing of a man staring straight down the barrel of an executioner's gun. He desperately needed a dead body and a forged will to get the keys to that warehouse. He planned to fence our deep-sea technology to black market buyers, take the cash, and buy back his own miserable life. But the most sickening discovery of all was hidden within a recovered chain of deleted text messages. Beatrice knew, my aunt, the woman who had grown up under my grandfather's roof, who ate his food and spent his money her entire life, knew every single terrifying detail about the Portland syndicate. When Declan had come to her, weeping and begging for salvation because the mob was threatening to break his legs, she did not reprimand him. She did not call the authorities or warn her father. Instead, blinded by her toxic, obsessive devotion to her favorite nephew, she actively helped him plot the assassination. The texts proved she had provided his alibi on the night the wires were cut. She had bankrolled the fake lawyer and the phony medical staff. She was entirely willing to sacrifice her own father to the freezing ocean just to keep her precious nephew breathing. I printed every single ledger, every intercepted message, and every bank statement, laying the paper trail out across my kitchen island. When Arthur walked into the room and silently read through the financial documentation of his own attempted murder, a profound shift occurred. The quiet, simmering betrayal in his eyes evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, calculated, absolute zero. We were no longer dealing with annoying family members acting out of petty spite. We were dealing with a rabid, cornered beast who would stop at nothing because his very survival depended on our total destruction. "We do not just block the asset sale," Arthur stated, his voice devoid of all warmth, sounding like grinding steel. "If we corner him now, he will just find another way to strike in the dark." I looked at my grandfather and nodded slowly. We had to let Declan think he was winning. We had to let him walk right up to the very edge of his supposed salvation. Let him gather all of his enablers and illicit buyers into one single room, and then pull the floor completely out from under them. It was time to weave the final net. The invitation arrived printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with embossed gold lettering. It announced the grand unveiling of a visionary new direction for our family legacy. Despite the terrifying reality that my grandfather was sitting in my living room, breathing and very much alive, my brother had chosen to double down on his suicidal gamble. Declan had unearthed an old, dormant corporate power of attorney from 5 years ago. Because the legal system moves at a glacial pace, that document had not yet been fully voided in the state registry. He was using that tiny, closing window of bureaucratic gray area to host a massive gala at our private harbor facility. To the public, it was marketed as a next-generation project launch. To the sharks swimming in the room, it was a fire sale. Declan had strategically invited the executives of every rival maritime salvage company on the West Coast. These were men and women who had spent decades trying to undercut my grandfather. Now, they were being treated to top-shelf champagne and catered caviar, while they secretly inspected the manifest of our cutting-edge deep-sea technology warehouse. They were gathered there to bid on remote-operated vehicles and pressurized diving suits, ready to sign liquidation contracts at a fraction of their true market value. My brother felt completely invincible that evening. His confidence was rooted in a deeply ingrained, fundamentally flawed understanding of my grandfather. For over 50 years, Arthur Chapman had operated under a strict code of stoic, old-money dignity. He fiercely protected the family name and never, under any circumstances, aired dirty laundry in front of the press or his peers. Declan was banking on that exact pride. He firmly believed that Arthur would rather suffer a quiet, humiliating defeat in a private courtroom than walk into a crowded, brightly lit pavilion full of local journalists and industry elites to cause a scandalous public scene. He thought the cameras and the wealthy guests were an impenetrable shield. Inside the massive, glass-walled event tent, erected right on the main dock, the atmosphere was nauseatingly opulent. A string quartet played softly in the corner, entirely drowned out by the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of predatory networking. My Aunt Beatrice was floating through the crowd, wrapped in a designer silk dress, beaming with the radiant energy of a newly crowned matriarch. She gripped the arms of rival executives, laughing loudly at their jokes, accepting their fake condolences about her missing father, and subtly guiding them toward the private viewing rooms to discuss purchase orders. At the front of the room, Declan stepped up to the polished wooden podium. He adjusted his expensive, custom-tailored suit and tapped the microphone. He looked out over the crowd of vultures and smiled. He began delivering a sickeningly polished speech about honoring the past while bravely stepping into the future. He spoke about modernization and liquidating stagnant assets to create a more agile corporate footprint. It was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak, entirely masking the reality that he was selling off our lifeblood to save himself from a Portland Mafia hit squad. I was so intoxicated by the sound of his own voice that he never noticed the shadows shifting outside of the glass walls. While Declan basked in the warm glow of the spotlight, the relentless coastal rain continued to beat heavily against the roof of the pavilion, just beyond the perimeter of the hired valet parking. A massive, heavily armored black sport utility vehicle rolled silently to a stop in the wet gravel. The engine idled with a low, menacing growl. The heavily tinted windows offered absolutely no reflection of the party inside. Inside the dark cabin of that vehicle, the air was as cold and sharp as a scalpel. I sat in the back seat, watching my brother gesture grandly on the stage through the rain-slicked window. Sitting right beside me was Arthur, dressed impeccably in a charcoal, three-piece suit. His posture was ramrod straight, and his eyes were fixed on the podium with the terrifying, unblinking focus of a sniper. We were not alone. Sitting in the front passenger seat was the most ruthless, highly feared corporate defense attorney in Seattle, and flanking our vehicle, waiting in two unmarked sedans, were four senior field agents from the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I unzipped a thick, waterproof leather portfolio resting on my lap. I slowly turned the pages, running my fingers over the pristine, undeniable sequence of our kill shot. The first document was an emergency psychiatric evaluation signed by three independent, board-certified neurologists, confirming Arthur possessed absolute, pristine mental clarity. The second document was a certified forensic laboratory report matching the fresh fingerprint pulled directly from the cut communication cables to my brother's criminal record. The final section of the binder contained 80 pages of intercepted wire transfers, illegal offshore routing numbers, and the undeniable paper trail proving Declan was funneling stolen corporate funds directly into the bank accounts of a known organized crime syndicate. We did not bring these files to negotiate. We brought them to execute a public corporate slaughter. I is getting ready to pass the contracts around, the attorney noted quietly, checking his heavy silver wristwatch. Once ink touches that paper, he commits felony wire fraud in front of a dozen witnesses. Arthur reached over and gently closed the leather portfolio in my lap. He adjusted his silk tie, his face completely devoid of mercy. "Let him finish his speech," my grandfather whispered, his voice slicing through the quiet hum of the engine. "Let him feel like a king for one more minute. Then, we take his crown." Inside the pavilion, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of roasted duck, expensive champagne, and the undeniable stench of corporate vultures circling a carcass. Declan stood at the head of a massive polished mahogany table, holding a solid gold fountain pen. Surrounding him were the chief executive officers of three rival salvage firms, all leaning forward with hungry eyes. The liquidation contracts lay perfectly flat on the table, representing the complete dismemberment of Deep Current Salvage. My brother smiled, a gleaming, arrogant expression of a man who believed he had just cheated death. He lowered the tip of the pen toward the signature line. At that exact fraction of a second, the heavy, double-glass doors of the event pavilion were violently kicked open. They did not just swing open. They crashed against their hinges with the force of a bomb detonating. A freezing, violent gust of wind from the Pacific Ocean roared into the pristine hall, carrying a horizontal sheet of heavy rain. The sudden pressure drop sent crystal champagne flutes toppling over and scattering perfectly arranged stacks of napkins into the air. The string quartet stopped playing instantly, their bows freezing mid-note. Every single head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Stepping through the storm, looking like a reincarnated god of the sea, was Arthur Chapman. He did not look like a frail, paranoid old man suffering from post-traumatic stress. He stood completely upright, a towering, majestic figure draped in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, untouched by the panic he was about to inflict. I walked exactly one step behind his right shoulder, my eyes burning with a cold, unrelenting fire. The entire pavilion, packed with dozens of Seattle's wealthiest maritime elites, fell into a suffocating, absolute silence. You could hear the rain aggressively pounding against the canvas roof. Declan froze. The gold pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the mahogany table. his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked like a man staring directly at a ghost who had come to drag him straight to hell. My brother opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate a sentence, a lie, an excuse. I did not give him the chance to breathe. Without uttering a single syllable of argument, I marched straight down the center aisle, grabbed the display cable from the stunned audiovisual technician, and plugged it directly into my tablet. I slammed my finger onto the screen. The massive projector behind Declan flared to life. The soothing corporate logo vanished, instantly replaced by the glaring, high-resolution images of Declan's secret, illegal offshore bank ledgers. I hit the next button. A heavily amplified, terrifying audio recording echoed through the pavilion speakers. It was the voice of the Portland Syndicate enforcer, explicitly detailing exactly how they were going to butcher Declan if he did not produce $3 million by the end of the month. Before the crowd could even process the reality of the mob debt, I played the final video. The giant screen showcased the grainy security footage from the marina. It played in a flawless loop, zooming in on the dark figure slicing the boat's communication cables, ending with a massive, undeniable freeze frame of the anchor tattoo on Declan's right wrist. "This is not a business launch," I announced, my voice amplified and echoing like thunder across the silent room. "This is a fire sale orchestrated by a desperate degenerate who attempted to murder his own grandfather to pay off a $3 million gambling debt to a violent crime syndicate." Pandemonium erupted. The rival executives at the table looked at the screen, looked at Declan, and violently recoiled, as if the contracts on the table were covered in acid. They realized instantly that if they signed those papers, they would be acting as accomplices to wire fraud, money laundering, and attempted homicide. They tore the liquidation contracts in half, shoving their chairs back and scrambling toward the exits to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. They did not get far. The second the contracts ripped, the glass doors of the pavilion were swarmed. Over a dozen armed officers from the Seattle Police Department and field agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation flooded the room. Their tactical boots pounded against the hardwood floor. "Federal agents, stay exactly where you are," the lead investigator roared. Two massive agents rushed the stage. They grabbed Declan by his custom-tailored shoulders, violently spinning him around and slamming his chest onto the mahogany table. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. My brother was hyperventilating, sobbing uncontrollably, his absolute humiliation completely exposed to the flashing cameras of the local press who had been invited to witness his triumph. Off to the side, a horrifying, shrill scream pierced the chaos. Aunt Beatrice, her designer silk dress drenched in spilled wine, shoved her way through the retreating crowd. She threw herself onto the floor at Arthur's feet, weeping hysterically, her carefully crafted matriarchal persona entirely shattered. "Father, please," she wailed, clawing at the hem of his suit pants. "He made a mistake. He was scared. You cannot let them take him away. He is your own flesh and blood. Please, show mercy." Arthur looked down at the woman he had raised, his steel-gray eyes utterly devoid of warmth. He did not see a daughter. He saw a traitor who had willingly signed his death warrant. "You stopped being my daughter the moment you helped him hand me over to the ocean," Arthur stated, his voice a lethal, frozen rasp. He looked up at the two private security guards standing near the entrance. "Get this woman off my property. If she ever sets foot on a single inch of my land again, have her arrested for criminal trespassing." The guards hauled a kicking, screaming Beatrice away, dragging her out into the relentless storm. Outside, as the federal agents frog-marched Declan toward a waiting armored transport vehicle, he dropped to his knees in the wet gravel. The heavy rain washed away his expensive hair gel, leaving him looking like a drowned, pathetic rat. He looked up at me, his eyes red and bulging with absolute desperation. "Rowan, please," he choked out, his voice cracking violently. "We are family. We grew up together. You cannot let them lock me in a cage. Blood matters. Rowan, please." I slowly walked over to him. The rain soaked through my jacket, but I felt absolutely nothing but pure, resolve. I leaned down, bringing my face mere inches from his ear, ensuring my words would be the last thing he heard as a free man. Blood does not cut each other's lifelines in the middle of the ocean, I whispered smoothly. I stood up, turned my back on his pathetic sobbing, and decisively walked away without looking back a single time. 2 weeks later, the storm had finally passed. The morning sun shone brightly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Seattle's most prestigious corporate law firm. Arthur sat at the head of a massive granite conference table, uncapping a polished silver pen. With a steady, unwavering hand, he signed a brand-new, ironclad will and corporate restructuring mandate. Every single voting share, every warehouse, and the absolute operational control of the Deep Current Salvage maritime empire was permanently transferred into my name. The remainder of his massive liquid fortune was locked into an unbreakable trust, dedicated solely to establishing a financial support fund for the families of commercial sailors lost at sea. As for Declan and Beatrice, their names were legally and permanently struck from the Chapman family registry, erased from history while they awaited their respective prison sentences. We had survived the deadliest storm, and now we owned the sea. Thank you so much, dear listeners, for tuning in and staying with us until the very end of this incredible journey. I would love to know, where in the world are you listening to this story from right now? Please let me know in the comments. As a reminder, because YouTube has disabled our monetization, we simply have no budget left to operate here, meaning we will not be uploading new videos in the foreseeable future. We are moving our entire operation over to Patreon. If you found today's story captivating and want to support our hard work, please help us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to our best, most exclusive, multi-voice, true stories that are far too intense and detailed to be publicized on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the Patreon QR code right here on your screen, or by using the link provided in the video description or the pinned comment below. Thank you for your endless support, and we cannot wait to see you there.